Chris Cutrone, aka the last Marxist, former, I guess, president or leader of the Platypus Affiliated Society. And the reason we're here today is basically because I was watching a stream on Theory Underground that Chris was on, and he mentioned something that kind of burrowed into my brain, and I figured that it would be a good topic to expand on. And that was the phrase, we should ease off the Marxism. And what does it mean to ease off the Marxism? Are we not in a time of where we need to be, building, where we need to be actually building for the next, great flow of the workers' movement, and we need to be ready? So yeah, what does that mean, Chris?
Well, okay, so of course, since I'm the last Marxist and I'm upholding Marxism and publishing these crazy books, and, I'm known for this, counterintuitively, I actually think that Marxism may not be terribly useful in terms of what has to be done practically now. And, I'm very familiar with the kind of sectarian Marxist left. I have a long history with that. Um, both in my own time and then with the millennial left. And the way I understand all the divisions ideologically on the Marxist left is that these are the sort of detritus of all the defeats of the 20th century. So pretty much every defeat generated a split in Marxism. And so we've had so many that we have hundreds of varieties of Marxism. And so can we put Humpty Dumpty back together again? No, probably not. Not exactly. However, there, if there's any hope of making Marxism relevant again, it's going to have to begin not starting with Marxism ideologically, meaning we can't refight the battles of the past. We can't get it right this time. We can't uphold one side of a split. We really have to see, to use the Hegelian expression, the rational kernel in all the various fragments of Marxism that exist, and even the fragments of the socialist left that's non-Marxist, like anarchism, etc., that we see out there. So if we look out at the left, we see a lot of different tendencies, all opposed to each other in some way. And they all have one thing in common, and that's, the infamous phrase from the Platypus Affiliated Society, the left is dead, meaning they're all the decomposed remnants of what once was an integral unity. But we'd have to achieve that again. It's not ready-made for us. We can't just pick up where the past struggles left off.
So I think I'm kind of hearing in the back of my mind here my former Canadian section of the IMT leader, Alex Grant, saying this sounds like misery. This is miserabilism. Do we not? He would say
It's just the truth. It's just the truth, Like, yeah, it is. We're in a miserable spot. Looked at a certain way, looked at another way, we have an open field of opportunity. Meaning, we got to turn the wasteland into an open field.
So is okay. So then, from the perspective, let's say an Orthodox Trotskyite, which is what
Where you're coming from?
where I'm coming from,
Where I'm coming from too, just a slightly different variety.
right? So they would say that the working class is maybe not as organized as it used to be, but it's larger than ever. The communism, socialism, these words are more popular than ever, and that revolutionary moments, upheavals are only going to be on the rise, and in the next 10, 20 years as the capitalism decays, and that it's important for a Marxist organization to be ready, right, to have the numbers when the time comes.
Well, that's the key, isn't it? The numbers.
Yeah.
These numbers on the ideological left are woefully insufficient, and also they're numbers of the wrong kind. Meaning, if socialism and communism are more popular than ever, among whom? Among students, right? Among petty bourgeois intellectuals, among like postmodernists. among like disaffected liberals, sure, but the working class? I mean, look, the working class is there, and the working class has actually suffered from the defeat of the socialist movement, I would say. And again, this is pure Trotsky,
Hmm.
meaning the defeat of the socialist movement is a setback for the workers, um, whether they know it or not. And the point is that they don't know it, meaning, do people recognize in their everyday life the results of defeat and failure? They don't, other than very maybe unconsciously, tangentially. And so I would say that really what needs to happen, I mean, I guess I go back to the beginning of the story. If it's Marxism, Marx and Engels, they didn't have to build a proletarian socialist movement that existed,
Right.
right? With a fairly developed ideology, whether looking at like French socialism or Chartism in England or, kind of post-Hegelian kind of socialism, communism among intellectuals in Germany. It was there. They're kind of late arrivals on the scene, and of course it was in their arrogance that they thought that they could sort of make sense of it all and say, okay, this is what it amounts to. It started with the critique of socialism. Marx and Engels, Marxism started with the critique of socialism. And that was the way that they were critiquing capitalism. We don't have that. We don't have that object of critique.
What? Right. Right now, especially like when I was in the organization, most of the critique was of isn't here's what the capitalists are doing, isn't that bad? Here's what the right wingers are doing, isn't that bad? Shouldn't therefore here's the only way out.
Yeah. I
That always
mean, the object of critique when dealing with like the most rank gangsterish opportunist capitalist politicians is pretty poor object of critique. You know,
yeah.
doesn't task us very much.
Yeah,
It's easy.
yeah, well, it's easy, and it's I don't know. It's also the same message every time. Like every article was the same
Bet
article.
this. This is my other phrase. You don't need Marxism for that,
Right.
right? Meaning the critique of capitalism in its present form, the critique of it economically, sociologically, politically, might only require liberalism. Thomas Piketty
So yeah,
might be at,
you mentioned that in the yeah you mentioned that in the stream too that um, maybe the type of work that is called for now is liberal is liberalism. But that
depending on what one means by that. So I'm always thinking, look, what did Marxists call the anarchists? They called them liberals. It's kind of counterintuitive. The anarchists would never accept that designation. So, I have a very old-fashioned Marxist definition of liberalism that isn't the Stalinist. And I'm afraid the poor Trotskyists have followed the Stalinists too much in this, right? In their kind of glib anti-liberalism or dismissal of anti-liberalism, kind of useful idiots liberalism, this kind of attitude. No, I mean, like the workers' movement in the 19th century was basically a liberal movement, and it had to come up against the limits of liberalism before it could embrace socialism, before an ideology restricted to the intelligentsia could find a mass appeal. In practice, liberalism had to reach its limits. It had to manifestly be inadequate. And we don't have that now, right? We have the Democrats and the Republicans in the United States, basically dangle liberalism before the masses. They both promise aspects of liberalism and never deliver on it. And they exploit that. They exploit that spontaneous, commonsensical liberalism, in our social relations. What our social relations demand sort of basic liberalism. And the capitalist parties take advantage of that ideologically. But you'd need an actual workers' movement to actually come up against, it's not good enough for the petty bourgeois movements to come up against the limits of liberalism, because that just leads to fascism. right? And or even, something less than fascism like nationalism, like the Black Panthers.
Mm.
Really? No. No, that's not the way. Sorry. Right? Revolutionary suicide, Huey Newton? No. That's not the way to go. Sorry.
So if you're a
You know,
young, energetic, uh, Marx friendly, maybe you've read some Marx, you've read some Lenin. Um, how what is a better option for that person to do than join now the Sparts or the IMT or now the RCP? Um,
or the RCA or the ACP,
yeah, well, not the
right?
ACP, definitely not the ACP.
Well, the MAGA communists aren't good.
No, no, bad, very bad.
They're all bad, they're all good. They're all whatever, useless.
Well, the
No,
ACP, they have no, they have zero like real world uh, numbers or organizing. Whereas at least
the sad thing about the Marxist tendencies is that they do have some real world experience, but I'm afraid it's pretty limited. So, okay, so in terms of what to do, so I've been teaching for 22 years Marxism academically through this whole period of the war on terror, the Great Recession, everything going on. And so before Platypus, I inspired students to become Marxists. And I was like, oh, I don't know if that's what I was trying to do exactly. And they did things like join labor unions as staff. They did some AFL-CIO internship and joined the labor movement. And I was like, yeah, that's not what I had in mind. Some of them joined sectarian Marxist tendencies, and I was also horrified at that. So then the question is, well, what do you do? In other words, if you join the AFL-CIO as an intern and you become staff, you become an organizer. If you join the Marxist left, the sectarian orgs, the ostensible revolutionary groups, then they might have you proletarianize. They might, right?
yeah, joining unions is part of it.
Yeah. And and I feel like, well, let's cut out the ideological piece of it, whether it's the AFL-CIO ideology, the Democratic Party ideology, or the so-called Marxist left ideology. Let's cut that out. Let's cut that piece out, shall we? And then what is it basically? I don't know if you've heard of this that here in Chicago where I've been for 31 years, the ISO, the International Socialist Organization, rest in peace. No, please, actually rest in torment. Um, they not rest in power, no. No, no, no. They were big in the Chicago Teachers Union. And, they had a member who rose to a level of prominence in the Chicago Teachers Union. And then there was a crisis within the ISO where they were like, oh, does this mean that the ISO is taking over the Chicago Teachers Union, or does it mean that the Chicago Teachers Union is
Mm.
taking over the ISO? Of course, it was the latter, right? Of course. It could never be the ISO taking over the Teachers Union in Chicago, one of the major cities in the United States, in the world. That's just not in the cards. So what really happened was, of course, it affected the tendency. And they recognized it. And they also recognized it that this was the way that the ISO was going to liquidate into the Democratic Party, which indeed they did. Meaning that's what them dissolving, choosing to dissolve the younger members, putting them in the position where they had to dissolve, that's where they end up, right? They end up in the Democratic Party. So the real challenge is not being a fringe tail of the Democrats, which is what the Marxist orgs are. Inevitably, structurally, objectively. Like that's the only thing that they can do, really. And a lot of it has to do with the ideology. A lot of it has to do with like meeting the people where they are, which really means meeting the students where they are,
Right.
which really means recruiting some students for a couple of years before they end up becoming Democratic Party activists of one kind or another. And then they use their Marxism to justify that. Like Van Jones was a Maoist. Yeah. So what does his Maoism get him? Well, he's one of the smarter Democratic Party politicos. right? He's one of the more sophisticated ones. He's one of the ones who's like, maybe we should think about the appeal of the Trump voter, right? That's what the Maoism gets you. It gets you a really smart centrism. That's what it does, actually, because it gives you a very clear-eyed view of things, which means that you're going to end up being a kind of a practical politician, a centrist. So, again, where do we stand now? What needs to happen now? I think what needs to happen now is the social movement has to be reconstituted. I think that's the real challenge.
But
I think that's,
how do you reconstitute a social movement without a um, some type of organization that keeps the memory of all previous social movements and keeps a continuity between them as they ebb and flow.
that's the challenge. So the so-called revolutionary continuity, I think that like going into my second round on the left, my first round on the left was in my own time as a Gen Xer. My second round on the left was with the millennials. And with the millennials, I had to bring with me what I learned from my experience as a Gen Xer, which is that the continuity was broken.
Hmm.
There was no revolutionary continuity because it's all like more or less implausible that the IMT or the Spartacists or whomever embody this revolutionary continuity. Right? It's like not, I mean, I understand they have to think that way, but no, what they're doing is they're reconstructing something, and they're doing it under the pressure of the present in a way that they have a hard time acknowledging. So actually the pretense or the delusion of revolutionary continuity actually gets in the way of them having an accurate recognition of either what they themselves are doing and also the nature of social and political reality. Like this is what I meant. We're not like picking up from 1938. We're not. It's done. The fascists won, the Stalinists won, the New Deal liberals won. They won. They completely won. So like totally. And so there's no continuity with 1938. There's no continuity with 1940. This is why, as much respect as I have for Trotsky, and I do, and I learned a lot from Trotsky, I'm not a Trotskyist because I know what that means. It means being frozen in 1938. And I think that, I mean, the problem is we can't ignore what's happened since then. We can't ignore, especially the new left and its effect, right? We can be anti-new left, we can argue against the new left, we can fight the new left, but then we're conceding to it, right? So, we're letting it set the terms, you
So
know. So that's the challenge is like the tradition is broken. The continuity is broken. It's done. It's over. Long time, like a very long time. It's 2024. Very long time.
so what?
Doesn't mean there's nothing to be learned from the history since then, but it needs to be learned in a way that isn't so biased by ideological Marxism.
Right. So what are the lessons that have been missed since 1938, since and since the New Left um, and neoliberalism that the Trotskyists and the revolutionary organizations have failed to account for.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think that, so Lenin, I think, in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, in the aftermath of the failed German Revolution, he wrote about climbing up the mountain, realizing you were not going to reach the summit of the mountain. And so you have to go back down the mountain and find another way up.
He did.
That's real. That's real. Right. And he says the way back down is actually more dangerous than the way up. You're more likely to lose your footing, lose your grip on the way down than you were on your way up. And that's what happened. They fell off the mountain. They didn't stay on the mountain. They didn't keep climbing the mountain. They didn't make an orderly retreat down the mountain. They fell off that mountain. We're at the bottom of the mountain.
So what's what's to stop me or any lefty type from just throwing our hands up and trying to go full Bernstein, be an MMTer, and
Uh-huh.
and fulfill the fantasy of capitalism without class struggle, if indeed there's nothing or little for a Marxist to do right now. Or why not just become social democrats or Catholics like everyone else?
Okay, so what I would say is, oh, hold on one second. I'm going in and out of focus. I don't know what's going on. Okay, here we go. So we're we're not even Bernstein, Edward Bernstein, the revisionist reformist. We're not. Like it's wrong to say that, I don't know, Jacobin DSA are Bernsteinian. Why? Because Bernstein actually assumed the existence of something that no longer exists, namely a very well organized mass proletarian socialist movement, the working class. And, not just in Germany, but indeed in England, the United States, France, that doesn't exist anymore. So we are sub-Bernsteinian, meaning he's a revisionist Marxist. We're pre-Marxist in the position that we're in, meaning Marxism is unmotivated. So it's not, okay, we have this mass movement. What do we do with it? What is its real goal? That was the revisionist question. Are we just sitting around waiting for 1848 to come back? Or is there a path forward now? That's a very different problem than the one we're facing, right? MMT, I mean, whatever. I don't know. Like maybe MMT would work for the capitalists. I mean, I'm in no position to judge it. Meaning it's all more or less hocus pocus. It's more or less based in reality. I'm not going to say, oh, well, Keynesianism is theoretically wrong because Marx said. Well, no, what Marx said has nothing to do with capitalist policy. So, again, if you want to be a liberal modern monetary theory type at a practical level to try to, I don't know, deal with wealth disparity and, problems of financialization, go for it. But again, that's not building a socialist movement, right? That's trying to convince the capitalist politicians to adopt a different policy. That's what the left has been in the position of doing since the 1930s. It's been a pressure force on capitalist policy, including a very, very loud, violent pressure force like guerrilla armies. States, whole countries
Mm-hmm.
are a pressure tactic on the capitalist rulers of the world. China, the Chinese Communist Party, they see themselves as keeping the American capitalist bourgeoisie honest. That's their task, right? Their task is to make sure that the US doesn't lead the world to full fascism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's their self-understanding. Um, and God bless. I don't know if they're doing that exactly. But so I think that first of all, who are we? Second of all, what should we be doing? And third of all, towards what end? I was faced with the choice as someone in my late 30s, arriving at kind of adult maturity, surrounded by students who were looking for answers. Was I going to start another Marxist sectarian group? I didn't. I very deliberately did not. Right? That's not what platypus is, and I've tried to prevent it from ever becoming that. And because I just know from my Spartacist experience what it's all about. Because it is the same. The Spartacists, the ISO, the IMT, they're at the RCP, USA, the Avakianites. They're all flavors of essentially the same thing. They're not fundamentally different in any way. They have their ideological differences. They differ at the level of ideas, but they don't differ at the level of what they are socially, politically, and the role that they play, the things that they do. They do protest demo interventions. They recruit students. They keep the revolving door of membership going, right? And I knew I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to set another one of those things in motion.
So, what is the project then that you thought about or attempted to start years ago, but that you and Doug are kind of trying to get off the ground now?
This is the campaign for a socialist party, which was totally premised on a misapprehension of mine, which is that Hillary Clinton was going to sail unopposed to the White House, unopposed by either the Democrats or the Republicans. I was wrong about both. She was challenged by Bernie and by Trump. And I didn't see that coming. You know, what I saw was, a failed presidency, Obama, but, with no real alternative to that, you know? And obviously the Democrats are trying to keep that going. Kamala Harris, Biden, they're trying to just continue and, blissfully unaware. So I thought, okay, this millennial left. But also at that time, so 2015, there was still like baby boomer new leftists with some life in them, with some organizing experience. Less my generation, but some people in my generation. And I thought, okay, what's to be done with these people? What's to be done with the radicalized millennials? What's to be done with the historical memory? But really, as organizers, as liberal organizers, with whatever ideology, Maoist, Trotskyist, whatever, anarchist, what have you, or just straight liberals. Um, what to do with these people, especially because before Bernie, there was millennial socialism. There was millennial socialism. There was an aspiration for socialism. They
Yep.
were
Yep.
reading Mike McNair, thinking about Kautsky and Lenin, Lars Lee, thinking about, oh, maybe the Second International wasn't so bad because after all, Lenin came out of the Second International. Yeah. So Jacobin, DSA, Bhaskar Sankara, it was a YDS, was a young democratic socialist from, high school. And he wanted to do something better than the ISO. And I guess he did, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, not really. Not really, actually. But kind of something. More people, less competent organizers, and less ideologically serious. For better or for worse. So that was my idea. My idea was, okay, again, the wasteland is an open field of opportunity. Also, my sense of the crisis of neoliberalism, my sense of everything kind of running out of steam, the NGOs, the sort of base of the Democratic Party kind of falling out from under it. You know, uh, I thought this is a fertile field for beginning, beginning a socialist movement. And I knew that it would be basically a kind of neurodnik, kind of go to the people
Mm.
kind of moment, like early SDS, like early 1960s, like ERAP program, like that kind of thing, like, well-intentioned, relatively privileged, intellectual types, some more or less fit to organize, maybe not too many of those. But I thought, okay, so what to make of this possibility? You had to redeem the millennial moment in a way that it wasn't going to redeem itself otherwise. So that was my idea. And then, of course, the last 10 years have happened. And the last 10 years have been extremely fucked up, meaning Bernie, Trump, COVID. Yeah. So,
It's been a ride.
nonetheless, and what else? Did I leave something out?
Oh no, it's been a ride.
Yeah, it's been a ride. Yeah, we could say it's been a ride. Um, yeah, I'm worse for the wear, I can tell you. I mean, I was doing okay until COVID, I think. I think COVID is what pushed me over the edge. Um,
Well, the
because
lockdowns,
the
really, the
lockdowns,
response to COVID.
the response to COVID, of course. Yeah, no, I had COVID and whatever, it's fine. I had the vaccine, I had COVID, whatever. And but the lockdowns, yeah. I mean that definitely interrupted what organizing we were doing because we were. I mean, we did get some things going in Chicago, in New York, also elsewhere in Germany. We got some things going. Um, and what I saw us doing was acquiring experience, training ourselves, learning to be activists, learning to be organizers. And learning from liberal activists, organizers, learning less from the left
Mm.
because I really thought, okay, I mean, one of the dangers is that starting anything like this, you're going to get dragged into these ideological squabbles that seem very urgent to people, but are not. Right. So for me, I'm looking at like a decades long process, meaning, all right, the millennials now I can say they kind of wasted their lives on Bernie and whatever sectarian experience they've had. So now they're the sage older people who have some experience, some advice to give to younger people. So you've wasted your life, you've sacrificed yourself. What will that have been for? What will have it all amounted to? And so, I don't think, for instance, like I got into a lot of trouble, Israel, Palestine, because it's definitely an issue of my generation, for sure. And I'm like, yeah, I know how this film ends. I know how this story ends. I know where this goes. It's not going anywhere. So ignore it. Meaning, we're not going to immediately divide the socialist movement that would begin on these kinds of questions, which they're always divided over. But no, because we can't do anything about it. Can't do anything about it.
So what do you
And
so what do you make? Yeah, we can't do anything about it. I agree, but what do you make of the strategy of, well, okay, going into the movement and pulling out potential cadres, recruits for from the demonstration and the protest movement?
now they're the wrong people. They are because they're rad libs and they're Democrats. They're just Democrats,
So
like serious.
so who are the right
Serious.
people
Who are the right people?
to go for?
Um, well, I think people who are alienated from the Democratic Party. I was
Mm.
reading an article back in 2017 from In These Times, written by two DSAers. Should the DSA be in the Democratic Party? I'm like, oh, those were the days. That's after Trump was elected. That's after the first Bernie campaign, which was a lot better than the second Bernie campaign.
Mhm.
And they were like, yeah, should we even be Democrats? Yeah, that's a, good question. And so, so the disaffection was real. I guess it was before the squad election, which gave people illusions. Um, I think, yes, some of those people might be the right people, actually, the people radicalized. Because, I will say about the Palestine solidarity protests, of course, it's about more than that. It's about what it symbolizes to people. It is about more than that. However, it's not like, I know this formula from the left. If you really care about the Palestinians, then you should be a Marxist, you should be a socialist,
Right.
you should be a Trotskyist,
That's right.
you should join our group.
That's right.
If you really care about Me Too sexual harassment, you need to be a Marxist. If you really think that Black Lives Matter, Marxism is for you. It isn't. No, Marxism doesn't answer those questions. Not at this point. It really doesn't. It gives you a kind of a worldview. It gives you a longue durée history. It can give you a sense of how the world has gone to shit since 1914, and Israel-Palestine is a perfect example of that. Balfour Declaration, collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the protectorates of Britain and France, and then the post-World War II world, the post-colonial world. Like, it's a perfect example of how the world has gone to shit since the early 20th century, since the collapse of Marxism. as a real movement in the world. But apart from that, it doesn't really tell you anything, right? It tells you only the most abstract things. And so anything that I've had to
Mm.
say on the issue, people are like, oh, this is just some Marxist abstraction. Yeah, pretty much. Like the workers have to unite to fight against the Zionists and the Islamists and the nationalists. And, you know, yeah, it's highly abstract Marxism, right? It has no practical nothing, right? So now, will people disappointed with the results of the protest movement be open to stepping back, reflecting, thinking about things? Some will, some won't. They all kind of will objectively, meaning they're just going to become liberal activists. They're just going to become NGO people. They're just going to go into academia and make token gestures, wear the keffiyeh to class, but they're going to make their peace with the Democrats, the status quo. They are. And then one fine day they're going to discover that they're on the other side of the issue. Actually, they're going to slowly, incrementally become apologists for the capitalist status quo, imperceptibly to
So
themselves.
so then there's a lot of disaffected Democrats just become Republicans or conservatives, or well they call
Sure.
themselves conservatives. They're not really conservative. Um,
Uh,
so a lot of them are kind of the same people. Like disaffected Democrat, what's the difference? And are
Radicalized intelligentsia. Yeah, and the alt-right and right-wing intellectuals who can give the left a kind of a run for its money in terms of ideas and interesting ideas and worldviews. Can give a more plausible, compelling, convincing description of reality, can satisfy people's paranoid fantasies better than the left does. But the left trades on the same thing, right? It's highly ideological, and it's very divorced from actual social reality. And I think that the task of would-be socialists is to discover social reality. And that's what we're
mm,
blind to with this ideology, right?
of the sectarians or
Yeah. And the right wing, of course. Yeah, yeah. The same. I mean, it's interesting. There's a platypus member who quit platypus to join the right.
oh,
He was a Bernieite, and then he became a Trumpite, and then he was disappointed in Trump because Trump wasn't radical enough. And I was like, yeah, I could have told you that. And so, uh, he went to the right, and then he found that the right was also lame and also ideologically fragmented. And everybody has their pet ideas. Everyone has their ID fix, obsession that they impose on reality. And, eh, then he's left wondering, this is all bullshit, and then left with a kind of the bullshit that I prefer or something, and having a generally cynical attitude about all of it, right? And depoliticized, I would say, you know, but also intellectually deranged, meaning, kind of lost the plot. And, all that I had to say to him was, there's a lot of crazy ideology out there. Marxism might be the only intellectually respectable thing if you're going to go down this intellectual highway. And there's a reason why people are always arguing against Marxism and come back to Marxism again and again and again. Marxism is resurrected in order to be slain over and over again. The right is obsessed with Marxism.
James
The
Lindsay.
liberals, yeah, everybody's obsessed with Marxism, and their obsession is driven by the fact that the kind of straw man that they set up is strangely unsatisfying to them. So they keep on like putting the straw man back together and dismantling it over and over again because they kind of know something there they're not quite getting. You know, so I think again my task. There's a big separation of theory and practice, a huge separation of theory and practice that we have to deal with. Recognize, first of all, and deal with. And that means respecting their separation because their separation is a real product of history. We can't undo that history. Right? We can't ignore it. We can't short circuit it. Right? And just put it back together again. We can't do that. So we really have to uh I always like to say this, and I wrote it in the foreword to my book, like I've been open to ever since the Spartacus League, I've been open to post-Marxism, anti-Marxism, non-Marxism, while I've remained a Marxist. But I've always been like, okay, convince me. Convince me Marxism is wrong. And what I've discovered is that under the challenge of all those things, postmodernism, anti-Marxism of all kinds, that actually it's deepened my appreciation of Marxism. It's deepened my appreciation of like what Marxism is capable of doing in terms of like seeing modern history, our historical moment, capitalism that we're still in, you know, because, like this techno-feudalism stuff, what we have to remember is not only is Marxism pronounced dead over and over again, capitalism is
Capitalism.
pronounced dead over and over again. And it hasn't happened yet, and I don't think it's going to. So, it's one of these things where that's actually a challenge, meaning the old form of capitalism dies, but capitalism continues, which means that a deeper understanding of capitalism is motivated. What do we even mean by capitalism? What is the essential thing that connects us back up with Marx's time? You know? So I think that, at an intellectual level, there's that. But at a practical level, you can't like
Mm.
just go to people and be a Marxist. Like I was at a debate that was held around the DNC here in Chicago. I participated in a debate about progressivism. And everyone was like, "Oh, you're really a Marxist." And I was like, "Yeah." And they were like, "What's Marxism about again?" Because they kind of recognized it but didn't recognize it. They were like, "Oh yeah, you sound like a hardcore Marxist, but that's not the Marxism I usually
Hmm.
think of." Right? And I think they were a little shocked when I was like, "Yeah, I don't think it's the capitalist's fault."
Right.
They're like,
Right. Marxism is about capitalists are bad guys and greedy.
"No," right? And so they were kind of shocked and intrigued. And another speaker on the panel, Benjamin Studebaker, was like, "Chris, you're much better talking to normal people than you are talking to leftists."
Well, that's the
And
way
I
it
was
should
like,
be.
"That's the way it should be." Yeah. So, but again, it's like I had to be really light on the Marxism. And I didn't even think I was
Mm.
being particularly Marxist. I didn't. I just said, well, I'm a Marxist, so I'm going to approach things a certain way. And so bear with me, you know. Things might have a contradictory result other than, what was intended, and progress might come in a paradoxical form. And they were like, "Oh, that's dialectical materialism." And I was like, "Yeah, it's also just reality, common sense, like, observable phenomena." It's like, you don't need this funny like madman Hegelian the more to tell you. Not really. It might help, but it might not help,
So in
you know?
that instance, you got people intrigued because you specifically eased off the Marxism.
Yeah. Because and obviously I've been doing this for a long time. So if I can't do that at this point, then I've really wasted my life. In other words, if I can't deftly handle my Marxism, then what have I been doing? I think that the miseducation that a lot of people get from the orgs, but also from the kind of debates that go on in and around Jacobin DSA, is that they're given a really awkward, clumsy form of Marxism
Mm.
that just won't suit, and really, like I said, gets in the way because it sort of resolves things. I guess that's the other warning that I'd give about like the sectarians, is that like, yes, I'm sympathetic to the Trotskyist argument, the Trotskyist narrative, Stalinism, right? However, it might falsely resolve some things.
Mm,
It might leave one with a kind of pat, complacent sense, right? I think that we really have to rethink these things for ourselves. We really have to reconstruct these things for ourselves and not reconstruct them just as intellectual puzzles, but reconstruct them out of social reality. And that does take, I guess, a certain kind of synthetic reasoning or something. I don't know. I hope that doesn't take some extremely strange genius, but it takes some creativity. It does, you have to be willing to think outside the box. And I'm afraid that Marxism is like blinkered, it's a
mm,
box. It's
hmm.
some place that people go in order to not have to think anymore.
Yeah, there was certainly an element of that in the party, especially in their kind of refusal to reassess some of their old takes and or update anything. Really, they were. It
I mean,
was.
I would say this. We might arrive back at the old orthodox positions. We might go all the way back and find ourselves in the exact same position, but it will have been earned.
Mm,
We need to earn it for ourselves, that position. We can't like get it ready made. You know, what Marx said about the Hegelians. The difference between Hegel and the Hegelians is that Hegel made his system and the Hegelians adopted it ready made. And that is a huge difference. Like one is a living thing, the other is a dead thing. Ready made, it's dead.
what does it mean to aim to create more socialists and less Marxists?
Well, that's the thing. Okay, so I think we need like actual like social movement activists. You know, I think that we need a socialist movement. I think we need organizers, militants. We need people who are in it for the long haul. You know, like as much as I can't stand the Maoists, you know, the Long March,
Hmm.
at least they have that perspective. At least they have that perspective. I mean, the thing with the Maoists is that they're there. They're always there. You may not see them. You may not see them for years, but they're always there. They're in the background. They're embedded in all these institutions. They are. They really are. Like the right is correct about that. You know, like my colleagues at the Art Institute, you know, the militants in the labor unions, yeah, they're all closet Maoists. They are. They really are. They actually are. And, you know, but they know how to keep a lid on it.
Hmm.
Now, of course, they do that opportunistically. They do it sensibly, but also they have their own stupid ideology regarding that. You know, like mass work, the backward, the advanced, the conscious. Again, these kind of gimmicky things. You know, I got into an argument in early on in my campaign for a Socialist Party. I got into an argument with an ex-FRSO, a millennial ex-FRSO activist. And he was like, you know, we have to orient towards the advanced rather than the backward. And I was like, okay, because you know, I know this stuff. And I was like, so do you think that we're the conscious? Or do you think we are? Right? And I was like, yeah, I wouldn't be so sure of that, first of all. And second of all, you know, we go into a milieu, we're doing anti-police brutality, we're doing immigrant workers' rights, we're doing renters' rights. Can you be sure off the bat? Can you sort out immediately who the backward and who the advanced are here? Really? Are you that sure of your being the conscious that you know who's backward and who's advanced? I'm not, you know? And so again, it's like this framework was a real blinder, you know? And it's like, I mean, he was willing to say, yeah, we really can't have any pro-Trump people. And I'm like, I don't know, Chicago? Like if we're in the black community and people are fighting against police brutality and a young person who's curious might be a Trumpite, you're really going to say that makes them backward off the bat, right? Especially when all they know is the Democratic Party.
I see.
You-
I would take that guy probably far quicker than half of the people I saw that came and went, or sometimes came and stayed in the IMT when I was there. The amount of leftism and postmodernism and identity politics that remain despite all of our official critiques.
Official positions.
Yeah,
No, it doesn't matter. Yeah,
no, it did
I
not
know.
matter. They would say the words. They would say the critiques, and it, and yet it was
People
this,
concede. They concede and they're desperate. And I just feel like, again, I feel like I'm old enough that what is it that Trotsky said? Entire generations thrown into discard, right? To build communist parties and an international anew from 1933. He says, yeah, the Second International, the Third International, they're dead. Entire generations have been thrown into discard, right? And I've seen it. I've seen it in my lifetime. I've seen entire generations thrown into discard. And so I'm prepared for that. And we have to be prepared for that. And that's where this idea of like, again, the artificial character of these orgs, they have to recruit a certain number of youth in order to keep their paid staff going, right? They need the tithes, they need the dues. They do. I mean, it's ultimately about money. It is. And some of them have like foundations, some of them have like some inheritance from somebody, some of them have rich donors who give them money. But in order to keep their staff full-time employed, they do need a certain turnover of membership to keep paying dues. They do. I mean, that's just a reality. And
they would say that helps keep them more democratic and more accountable.
well, keeps them opportunistic, again in subtle ways. They concede without realizing it. So, I mean, I'm not wholly unsympathetic, but I just think it's a model that is played out. It's done. I think the first generation of Trotskyists after World War II played out. Like obviously, like Ted Grant, Max Shachtman, James Cannon, whomever, right? Who are the UFO people in Latin America?
Oh,
Posada,
yeah, yeah,
Posada, Pablo and Ernest
Pabloists, yeah,
Mandel, and
Mandelites,
and so, Jerry Healy,
Cliff,
Jerry Healy,
Cliffites.
yeah, the Tony Cliff, absolutely. And I feel like, what strikes me, because we did in Platypus, we did a close reading of all the post World War II writings of all the various Trotskyists. And, we read what Tony Cliff was writing after World War II. We read what Ernest Mandel and Schachtman and Cannon and everybody. And it's like, this is an obvious fall off the cliff from Trotsky. Like, it's just obvious. They're lost. Totally lost. And, and they were better than people are now. Right? So that's where I feel like we have to embrace what is otherwise a liability as an asset. Like we really are at the bottom of the mountain. We're really at the beginning. And that can be terrifying. There's no safety net here. It
So,
really is not. Nothing to fall back on.
so then, what kind of principles, foundations, values, or whatever? How do you create a socialist party today from scratch, from Marx, I guess, and Engels, but that doesn't fall into the 1917 and 1938, or even the New Left, and
68.
yeah,
68. I mean, I think that the challenge is this. Again, easing off the Marxism, the way I describe it is keep it in the back pocket.
yeah,
Keep it on the shelf, however obscured by Star Wars Legos. Keep it on the shelf, right? We'll reach for it at some point. And there's other things there too. I have my mementos from 2016 election. I've got the little action figures of Bernie and Obama and Trump and Hillary.
they have action figures.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Yeah, I stopped with them though, because after that they started releasing AOC and stuff, and I was like, yeah, no, I could skip all that. But I think that we have to learn how to be good liberal civil society activists on behalf of the working class, discipline ourselves to the task, learn about social reality. And the only difference between us and your NGO people is the goal of socialism, right? In other words, understanding that this
Mm.
is a long-term strategy, long-term orientation. It's not even a strategy exactly. Because that assumes that we have the steps plotted out. We don't, right? So, earlier in the history of the millennial left, they had their kind of like Hal Draper moment, their kind of microsect critique moment and their Marxist center moment. There was this kind of attempt to build a Marxist center, the Philly Socialists, people sort of around the DSA but didn't want to jump in with the Bernie campaign DSA. There have been moves in this direction. And again, I feel like it was hampered by ideology, meaning, do we need a Marxist center? Kind of. I mean, again, even Draper in the 70s could assume some things that were probably wrong at the time, but far more plausible than they would be now. He had more of a sense of living continuity that was illusory, but also more based in reality, right? He was a direct acolyte of Max Shachtman, who was himself a direct acolyte of Trotsky. It was like it was within living memory, if we put it very simply. In 1973, there were people who had the experience of the Russian Revolution. There, people were still alive,
Hmm.
right? There was, between 1917 and 1968, is less time than between 1968 and now. And also a different quality of time, different quality of historical experience. I feel like my lifetime has been inert, glacial. It's had its shocks, but it hasn't really moved, or all the movement's been on the right, we could say.
Hmm.
Neoliberalism. Um, Now, again, I think that the trick is going to be not getting into false disputes. Not engaging prematurely in unmotivated things. We have to sort of, I mean, there are models in terms of like really basic stuff that actually isn't too ancient. Like you said, okay, go back to Marx and Engels. Actually, the left used to know these things as late as the 70s and 80s. They used to know things like socialists support gun rights. Like just basic stuff. Free speech stuff, obviously.
Hmm.
Civil liberties stuff. Again, the Maoists and the anarchists had their kind of deep underground mutual aid kind of practices that helped them. I think that the problem with the Trotskyists is that the Trotskyists still had this splitting and regrouping idea, like intervening in the Marxist ideological left and sort of, creating a revolutionary party out of that. And again, the anarchists, because of their anti-Marxism, and the Maoists, because of their kind of long march orientation, were free of that pretense, free of that illusion about like, okay, we're gonna like convince everyone that the answer to all their questions about Marxism is Trotsky, right? And they'll learn from experience. They'll see we raise the banner of Trotskyism, and then people see, and then they learn the lesson, and then they come to us. Hasn't happened. It hasn't happened since 1938. Trotsky built a movement up through 1938, and then after that, it didn't fare so well. Right? It split over the Hitler-Stalin Pact and never quite recovered. Right? So again, it's plausible at some level, but at the same time, we have to sort of snap out of it and realize, well, no, there's no shortcut. There's no direct line between Marxism as a theoretical perspective and the practical tasks of our moment. I mean, I guess my experience has been I've had to reconstruct Marxism for myself. And I've had the time and the energy, I've had the headspace to do that most people don't have. And I've been teaching Marxism academically, which keeps me disciplined in a particular way. But also, I did Platypus, which also disciplined me in a particular way. This kind of experience is not available, not widely available, And therefore, it can hinge on that. It can hinge on that, on like making sense of it intellectually. Like I said, it takes a kind of synthetic kind of genius reasoning something to say Murray Bookchin was right. Like, listen, Marxist. Yeah, he was right, actually. Right. In many essential ways, even though he was an ex-Trotskyist, and so his rejection of Trotskyism was correct and incorrect at the same time. You know, um, I had to get over a lot of my allergies,
Mm.
you know, see the rational kernel and things. But that's just a lot of effort that may not really be necessary for the task at hand. The task at hand is building a movement and really training people to be able to organize a movement, acquiring that experience, learning about social reality, learning about what possibilities there really are. And it will initially be on the like objectively, we're confined to doing what a lot of people on the left do. They do it for objective reasons. So it's just having an awareness about what we're doing, the problems potentially in what we're doing, the liabilities, the pitfalls, and the goal. And I'm afraid that whether it's DSA Jacobin or the Marxist orgs, they have a certain way of understanding what they're doing that I actually think doesn't leave them as open as they need to be. They again, I think that, in terms of reaching the working class, because that's, yeah, earlier I said MAGA communists, they're no good. Yeah, they want to reach the workers, and God bless, you know, and they think, well, the way you reach the workers is you have a Fourth of July barbecue.
You tell the Republicans, basically.
Yeah, you tell the Republicans, right? And I'm just like, yeah, there's just no easy way. Like we're not gonna reach the working class that way. There's no magic trick. There's no like abracadabra solution here. And so we will be on the fringes of the liberals. We will be on the edges of basically the control regime over the working class that the capitalists have established. And we'll also be in the domain of things that have a highly mediated relation to capitalism and yet clearly are integral to capitalism. The way I always like to put it is we'll be in the ecosphere of the churches and the gangs.
Right. You mentioned that in the stream.
I mean, there's a reason why labor unions were mobbed up when they were vital. In other words, if the labor movement has removed the mafia from it, it's only because labor movement is dead. Meaning it's not a going concern. It's not something that the mafia would bother with
Mm-hmm.
because it's dead, right? So, like a real movement is going to be faced with the competition of organized crime and religious organizations. That's who we're going to be competing with. In terms of the ecosphere, and we're also going to have to learn to live alongside them, right? Not be a threat to them. And to slowly ease them into what they really are, which are lackeys of the capitalists, right? Because of course they are, right? And I also think that the churches and the gangs are more honest, meaning they all have their jacked up ideology, they have their own crazy, like, I don't know, Like the Mexican gangs are all like Aztec warriors, like, and I'm just like, that's all as plausible as what the Marxists say they're doing. Except the Marxists are not doing anything. At least the gangs are doing something with their Aztec, Aztlan ideology, you know, or their black nationalist ideology or whatever.
Right.
Um, their strange rituals, they're more effective in reality. And so their ideology is no less connected to reality than Marxism is.
Right. It's made real. It's made material.
Yeah.
Um, so DeVos just mentioned something in chat that came up in this last stream as well. The trick is not using the word Marxism or socialism. What he said, and I think Dave kind of was talking about this as well. And
Uh-huh.
it brings up the question of like, similarly, like should what you and Doug are calling the Socialist Party? Do we call it the Socialist Party? Is that still a thing that makes sense, or and how does that like what's the difference?
For the cognoscenti, meaning, I mean, I don't know how I feel about socialism being made into a mainstream word. Like I feel like it has its positives and negatives. It has its benefits and it has its liabilities.
Is it
Um,
better than communism?
sure, I guess so. I mean, I feel like communism, the only virtue of communism is that it's strange. Where socialism might have been rendered banal by Bernie and the squad.
Right. It sounds more hardcore to be a
Sounds
communist.
more hardcore. And Marxist ain't bad for that. Marxist is pretty core, and I've written about how people who are eager to call themselves communists and not Marxists, that there's a concession there. Like a Alain Badiou, I'm a communist, not a Marxist. It's like, yeah, that's a concession. And meaning communist, it's not that hardcore, in fact. Marxism, that's pretty hardcore. But again, like, I mean, I'm not for hiding anything. It's just which foot forward do you put? And so,
Mm.
I think that you work with people, you identify as socialist, and you don't try to recruit them to socialism. You make them interested in your socialism based on what you do.
Right. You lead. Yes. Yeah. You you lead by example, or you get victories by your own work, and that's how people are drawn to you.
I mean, the way that I also have conceived of it, and it works to a certain extent based on the limited experience that we've had so far, is that, there are all sorts of what people would call single issue. There are all sorts of domains of activism that are very disconnected. There's, like I said, anti-police brutality, there's immigrant workers' rights, there's renters' rights. They're all in their own spheres. They're all disconnected, except they're not. Meaning, how are they connected now? Through the Democratic Party, right? So all the activists in those various domains, they do have a kind of clearinghouse. They do have a common denominator, and
Mm-hmm.
that's as Democrats. So calling ourselves socialists is just to say, there's actually a way of connecting up these things that isn't the Democratic Party. That would be the only point, is to say, oh yeah, I saw that guy, he's a socialist. Yeah, he was doing this other thing and now he's over here doing this. Right? Like seeing that actually socialists are interested in all these things. Now, the problem with the sectarian left is the limited resources that they have. They have to like pick and choose where they're going to like prioritize their intervention. And I mean, they usually do keep fingers in all sorts of things, but they have these sort of limited, interventions, right? So I think that that's another thing that we have to avoid, the idea that socialists are intervening in struggles.
Yes, that word was very common in the IMT.
Yeah, and I don't like that. Um, I think that we're not intervening. We're in a much more humble position. We're not vying for leadership. We're not. If we end up in a leadership position, we should be at first wary of that. because then we're going to get sucked into the Democratic Party game, actually. So, meaning, you know, I think that would-be socialists have to be careful about taking on responsibilities that they can't actually fulfill.
That is one thing that the IMT got right. We warned against people taking leadership before there was any base of support around them in any organization.
Right. I mean, they know some things. Of course, they know things, right? But again, it's how they understand the overall strategy and the overall goal. I mean, the ISO was the organization that I was most close to in the platypus millennial left era. And I was shocked that they were like, oh, yeah, we're not going to have socialism for 100 years. You know? And I was like, yeah, maybe not in 10 years, but 100 years? Really? And that was like the Tony Cliff perspective during the Cold War.
Mm.
He thought the Cold War would last 100 years. It didn't, right? And then in the post-Cold War period, they were like, oh, we're back to the 30s. That was their 1990s perspective. And that also didn't quite work out. So they got disoriented because they had a kind of, again, artificial notion of the time horizon and the strategy that they were working with. Whereas I think we have to keep an open mind about these things. We really can't gainsay it that way. You know, like I don't know what the IMT's like backroom discussion is about like perspectives, you know, like, you know, I mean, I'm afraid that they might be like a lot of Trotskyists. They might think, oh, a small group could be catapulted to a leadership position in a revolutionary situation.
Of course. Yeah, that's the position.
Yeah, and no, no. Like, you know, you really need a movement, like a real movement, like established. Meaning, like, the Russian Social Democrats had a preeminent role in the Russian working class long before 1917. And then there were other like non-orthodox quasi-Marxist socialists, you know, the socialist revolutionaries who also had a presence in the working class, even though they were like peasant socialism, they weren't really, right? And so, you know, and that's for decades, established, built up over a long period of time. You know, and the Marxists came out of the Narodnik movement. They weren't instant Marxists. They had to be convinced that Marxism was a better answer than a kind of Tolstoyan, kind of quasi-Marxist, kind of loose Marxist, kind of Narodnik socialism. They had to be convinced that there's a point to being orthodox Marxists. It wasn't instantaneous. Um, it took them experience, like practical experience, to get there. Right? So we're just not there. Like, what practical experience is being acquired, really? Again, not the practical experience of keeping a sectarian group going. That is considerable, but it's not really fit for purpose. It's not really the kind of organizing experience that we need. Like recruiting students to Marxism does take some skill, does take organization, but not nearly as much as we really need to build a movement. All right, it's very specific. And I think that we have to acquire a variety of experiences. And we also have to see, you know, like the nature of the working class, like today, the nature of the working class, like, you know, what is the working class in the United States today? Really? Like, what are the possibilities for organizing? Not this kind of a logistical, like, oh, choke points, Amazon warehouse, logistics. Like, what are the strategic choke? No, 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 no. That might be true, but we're nowhere near that. So forget about that. Like, what are you talking about? You know, like, come on. Um, I mean, that may or may not be true that people are so dependent on Amazon that it's easy to organize Amazon workers. I don't know if that's true. It's probably a lot more contingent than that, you know? Or people need their coffee, and that's where Starbucks workers can be organized. Yeah, I don't know. You know, so again, I think that the challenge for people on the left, I mean, look, I'm in academia, so I know that there's a lot of academic leftism, and I know that it reaches down into grade school and high school. Like, I know that people are reading Howard Zinn in high school, and
Yeah.
I'm just like, fuck. I'm like, I'm sorry. Yeah, maybe the socialists are going to come from the schools that don't teach Howard Zinn.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Because if you believe that history is history, you're probably never going to be a Marxist. Not really. You'd be like a Gerald Horne Marxist or something. You're going to be like, nah, it's just not. It's just going to totally warp you beyond any recognition of social reality, what actually needs to be done. It's going to bias you just irremediably. Again, I've lived long enough to know that that's a thing, right?
That's
That,
what I
that
dealt with in high school and university. Literally,
yeah.
Zinn and Naomi Klein and Chomsky and the rest, and it
All
was
Stalinisty. It's all petty bourgeois, radical Stalinisty, nationalisty type stuff. This anti-imperialist stuff. I mean, look, I get it. Yeah, U.S. imperialism is like a scourge in the world. But again, what are we going to do about it? Right? Like, we don't need like to
we
raise
support Iran and China
fuck, fuck, fuck,
and Syria.
Hamas, Hamas.
That's right,
They do. They
freedom
support Hamas.
fighters.
It was one thing when it was the Sandinistas in Cuba, but now it's Islamists. But again, it's kind of like this is not a good model. Like, yes, the US shouldn't be, stomping all over the world, you know, murdering with impunity. Okay, yeah, but you don't need Marxism for that. You don't need socialism for that. You could be Green Party, you could be Ralph Nader, you could be Glenn Greenwald, you could be whatever, right? You could be Max Blumenthal. Great, cool. That's just your petty bourgeois radicals, right? They just want to change the policy. So, yeah, Z Magazine, that was my contemporary phenomenon, you know. And I just think again, the United States is clearly still the center of global capitalism. For better or for worse. We got to deal with it. We're lucky to be here in the sense of this is where the action is, the needed action. May not be where the actual action is, but it's where the needed action is. The absent but needed action. Um, I had a professor in college, Iqbal Ahmad, who was Pakistani American. So, really Indian, because he predated the partition of Pakistan and India. And it turns out Edward Said considered him a mentor. Go figure. Now, Iqbal didn't really think much of Said's work.
Mm.
And he also didn't think much of the American left. And he had been a 60s radical here in the United States. He had fought with the FLN in Algeria. He had a very kind of colorful personal history. He had been all sorts of places, done all sorts of things. Fidel Castro, Ho Chi Minh, like the Forrest Gump of the post-war left. And I said to him, he's like, Chomsky is about as good as you can get in the United States. And I said to him, Iqbal, you really going to sell us short like that? Like, really? He's like, yeah, well, realistically, this is about as good as the American left can produce. And I took that as a marching order task. You gotta do
Challenge.
better. Yeah, as a challenge, you know? Because I just, I kind of couldn't believe it. Because he knew that, Chomsky was full of shit in a lot of ways. But he's like, yeah, this is about as good as it gets. This was in like 1989, around that time.
Well, even in the 2000s, when I was coming up as a young leftist, like there was no one to listen to other than Chomsky and Michael Parenti and uh, Naomi Klein, basically.
I mean, they've made their decisions. I am a student of Moishe Postone. and of Adolf Reed. Adolf, I got much more of a political education than from Moish. Adolf, you know, made his decision circa 1980. Struggle for socialism is over. We have to fight the right. We have to fight this neoliberal onslaught. We have to fight for reforms that create conditions for a renewed working class movement, not a socialist movement, a working class movement. That hasn't worked. In other words, that was plausible, maybe, but, you know, these people have made their compromises. They've made their decisions. They've made their estimation of what's possible, and they've stayed there. And they've kept everyone else there. And I also knew a lot of Adolf's students, and I was shocked he had no students, meaning none of his students really wanted to be Marxists or socialists.
Mm.
Not really. They were like, oh, yeah, Adolf is the socialist, Adolf is the Marxist. They kind of fobbed it off on him. They brain trusted it to him. And I was like, well, the only way you can really honor the education you got from Adolf is to try to be a Marxist. And instead it was like, yeah, no, because Adolf himself was like, no, there's no point in being a Marxist. No, no, no. No, no, no. You'll just end up a Trotskyist. You know? I mean, he never forgave me for being a Trotskyist. Right? And even though he told me to read Adorno, he told me to read Adorno. He was the first one to really tell me to read Adorno. But then he never forgave me for becoming an Adornoite either. Yeah. And so, um, I just think, again, when dealing with the left, especially the older generations of leftists, what we have to understand is that they've made their compromises. They've framed things for themselves. But we're not living in their time anymore. Like maybe that made sense when they made the compromise that they made to become who they became. Perhaps that's what was needed in the 1980s. Maybe. I don't think so, but okay. Well, we're not still there, right? So again, we can't when we take on perspectives ready-made, we really have no way of understanding just how much we're conceding and how stuck in the past we're becoming. Like people's history of the United States is a historical artifact of a particular moment that itself was based on a previous perspective, right? So it's like keeping us stuck in the 60s, keeping us stuck in the 90s, keeping us stuck. And so we have to be very careful about that. Again, it's not like the struggle continues. No. I mean, the image that I had with the millennial left was the Titanic went down, but it didn't go down in the Arctic. It went down in the tropics. And so, we could take a life raft and end up on an island somewhere, right? And that's where we are, right? So 99% of the historical experience of the left is gone. It's at the bottom of the ocean. We've got some little pieces, little remnants, little artifacts to go on in terms of basic orientation, right? But apart from that, we're going to have to do this for ourselves.
All right, Chris, I think that's a good good spot to end on. Thanks for doing this. All right, everybody, ease off the Marxism. And yeah, we'll go from there. Thanks a lot, Chris.